So when I started with this research, I basically got this mandate that biologists were most qualified. I had surveyed Americans and I asked them, is it an important question in the abortion debate? The question of when life begins. They said it was. They said that Americans deserve to know when life begins, to
Yeah.
be informed in their positions on abortion, as well as in their reproductive decisions, which suggests that, how can one have informed consent if they actually do not view that fetus as a human, if it's a human, right? Would you make the same decision if you were misled into believing it's no different than a skin cell,
Yeah.
or if you understood it to be a human, right? So I basically got this mandate, how I saw it, that as a mediator, your job is to resolve factual disputes. It's very hard to resolve opinion disputes.
Yeah.
So, in this discussion, I can't tell you how to value human life, but we can understand whether or not it is a human life, whether or not it is a human. So what I did was I started surveying biologists. I actually went online and I went to probably around 2,000 websites for colleges and universities around the world. I spent over 500 hours just myself. People said,
Wait, you said 2,000 websites to give you access to by far far greater number of colleges and universities around the world, right? I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah.
The number 2,000 wasn't the number of universities. That was the number of websites that you visited.
Yeah. So
Okay,
this was,
right.
I had to translate
Sounds like
Chinese
fun.
websites into English, Russian websites into English, because it wasn't enough to just do American biologists, because obviously one could argue that Americans have a pro-life bias, or at least that because it's controversial, they might be more inclined to affirm it. So I wanted to understand around the world, do biologists see, a human zygote as a human? Do they believe,
as much as possible, get the cultural bias out of there?
Exactly.
Yeah,
or
right.
even understand the cultural bias. So maybe one culture doesn't recognize that and another does.
Yeah, okay.
So I ended up collecting tens of thousands of biologists' contact information, and I started my survey. So this was a survey. It went through many different variations. This was working with biologists, geneticists, to figure out, how do I actually ask this in the most objective scientific measure possible? Because I don't want it to be in a moral register. I wouldn't ask a biologist, isn't it true that abortion is murder? Like, isn't it true that abortion kills a human? Like, that's so loaded, and you're invoking their political perspectives, their philosophical perspectives. So for me, it was important to just focus on the biology. From a biological perspective, when does a human's life begin? Does mammalian development start at fertilization? So I posed them 5 different operative items, and then I even asked them an essay question, because I wanted to make sure I wasn't just pigeonholing them into one perspective. I wanted them to speak freely about how they view the beginning of human's life. And unfortunately, this study that I'm describing was stopped 5 different times over the course of a couple years. And it involved me having to meet with my school's legal department, the research administration. There were countless complaints from biologists, from other people who learned of my study, because I wasn't flying under the radar, having conversations with biologists. I sent out tens of thousands of emails in a moment around the world. So everybody became clued in on, whoa, what's going on here, right? Why is this guy doing this survey? And I had people threaten me, saying that I'm gonna notify my colleagues to not answer your survey because you're a pro-life plant and you're just a Christian, you're a zygote worshiper. I mean, the kinds of things people said to me, you seem like a Ku Klux Klan member, or it seems like Trump designed this survey. I mean, just
okay.
And they're all PhDs.
I want to be clear, and you need to, and I'll get our guys to make sure there's a link to your stuff on our where we're going to post this on YouTube.
Yeah.
The questions you're asking, they could not be less what they just described. I mean, it's basically, essentially, I can't remember the exact wording, but in some of them, it's like a mammal's life begins at fertilization. I mean, And so it's like, yeah, that's like crazy fascist there, right? To ask a biologist
Right.
to answer the question of when does a mammal's a new distinct individual organism come
Yeah.
into existence. And you just ask biologists to speak in their area of expertise. And this was the response you get, that you had to meet with legal teams because you said, "Hey, biologist, when does an organism begin to exist in the mammal family?" Oh my gosh, you're a monster.
And and in the context of science, I mean, this has been undisputed since the early 1830s, when a German biologist understood that all mammalian life begins as a zygote.
Yeah.
This is something. It's actually the reason why we had restrictive abortion laws in the United States from the 1860s to the 1960s. Most people don't know this, but abortion was banned throughout the country in every state except for life of the mother exceptions. That was the only circumstance in which
Yep.
one could have a legal abortion. And this was because the American Medical Association, they propagated the view that it's a human. So since it's a human's life, under typical homicide statutes, abortion should be treated as the killing of a human. So, I mean, this scientific perspective, I understand that it's been lost in recent decades because it isn't politically convenient
Yeah.
for some people. But I mean, it's
And
fairly. I mean, I
you
had
didn't
some
ask them to
biology.
speak to the right or wrong of it. You
No,
didn't
no,
ask them
no,
to weigh in. You didn't ask them any
no.
philosophical question. You directly asked them for information that was relevant to their
Yeah.
field. And that is, as you just said, is probably the easiest question they're going to be asked all day.
And some actually suggested that this was beneath them, that I wasted their time on something that is so simple, so elementary. But it's like in a time in which people don't know this.
Yeah.
About 45% of the country understands that it's a human at fertilization. They believe when presented with these items in polls, public polling, it's something like less than half recognize it as a scientific or biological fact, and instead they see it as a philosophical or religious belief.
Wow.
So, I mean, when you talk about a gap in science understanding, I mean, this is also some of the first research that showed that conservatives and pro-lifers are far closer to scientists on a scientific view than liberals and Democrats.
And when we get to the final resolution, right? It's 96% of the
Mhm.
more than 5,500 academic biologists, and I think, if I correct me if I'm wrong, 95% of them hold PhDs.
Yeah, I think that was right.
Yeah, that 95% of the
Hmm.
5,500 are PhD level academic
Oh yeah.
biologists, and 96% of them affirmed on one of the categories that you were given, that life
Yeah.
begins at fertilization. A zygote is the first stage of development for a
Mhm.
whole distinct and new organism, correct?
Right. And they did that on the basis of how do we classify organisms, right? Biologically, from that perspective, what is our approach? And it used to be morphological. It used to be based on your limbs, your appendages, basically what we can see on an organism. That's how early biologists classified things. Obviously, it'd be hard to classify a single cell as the same as a walking, talking human, right? But if you use the genetic approach, which is what is the dominant approach today in terms of
Yeah.
how we classify organisms, it's the simple question of, does it have human DNA? And that separates it from non-humans and non-human tissue. And is it developing in the human life cycle? And this is what distinguishes a human zygote from a skin cell,
Yeah.
or from a sperm, or an egg, because those things are haploid cells with only 23 chromosomes, and they're just not developing in the human life cycle. They're pre-humans, I guess, is one way you could describe them.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
Well, they're
like I said,
parts.
right, they're human tissue. The
That's
best way of describing it is human tissue.
They're
You can't.
cells that serve the
Yeah,
reproduction of another organism. They're part of an organism, right? And even and
exactly.
that's the weirdest thing for people to try to understand. Is like, look, the sperm does leave the man's body, but it still is the man's It is cells from the man, reproductive cells that are serving his organism
Yes.
by means of assuring reproduction. And so
Right.
they're reproductive cells, parts of organisms. They're not organisms in and of themselves.
Exactly.